This is Jeffrey Sachs, editor of Tradition. You're listening to an installment of an engaging series of conversations about issues facing modern Orthodox Judaism around the world. Your host for these conversations is Rabbi Alon Meltzer of Congregation Or Chadash in Sydney, Australia, talking with authors from Tradition's recent Rabbi Norman Lamm memorial volume. Visit traditiononline.org to order that volume, sample open access chapters, or subscribe to our Journal of Orthodox Jewish Thought. This series is produced by Or Chadash in cooperation with Tradition. Our thanks to Rabbi Meltzer for his leadership on this initiative. Here's the conversation.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Rabbi Alon Meltzer. I am the Rabbi of Or Chadash Synagogue. For those that are in Sydney or in Australia, you will know, obviously, how important it is for us to do an acknowledgement of country. For those of you who are international, the tradition in Australia is to acknowledge the indigenous peoples, the first peoples of Australia. I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which I sit, the Bidjigal and Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay homage to their elders past, present, and emerging. And the reason we do this, I think, is manyfold. But specifically as Jews, we have such a connection to our own land that it's incumbent upon us to acknowledge the traditional indigenous owners of the land in which we sit. We are extremely excited to be joining with you all tonight as we hear from the incredible Rabbanit Chana Henkin. This is the first of 8 classes within our winter series called Modern Orthodoxy. It is, I don't have the book, oh no, I do. It is based, it was born out of this journal, the Tradition Memorial Journal for Rabbi Dr. Norman Lamm, focusing on a myriad of different topics that Rabbi Lamm wrote about in his illustrious career, spanning many decades and informing many generations. And scholars from around the world and from across the gamut of Orthodox and modern Orthodox thought wrote articles in response to some of his writings on various topics. And so this series really explores those thinkers, Rabbi Lamm's writings, and it really is a springboard for many conversations that we can have around the challenges and really the exciting future paths of what modern Orthodoxy has in front of it. We are, as I said, joined by Rabbanit Henkin. We are so incredibly lucky to start this series off with such an incredible scholar, a founder and change maker, and I don't want to say an agitator, but just someone who has changed really the face of modern Orthodoxy for so many of us. She's the founder and dean of Nishmat, perhaps one of the most acclaimed and well-known seminaries and education centers for women and female scholarship. She and her late husband, Rav Yehuda Henkin, founded and created the Yoetzet Halacha program, which is a program that trains women around women's health and Jewish law, addressing questions of Torah Mishpacha, and really has provided an incredible leap forward for female leadership across the world. We are just so happy to have you, Rabbanit Henkin, and I think I'm just going to pass it straight over to you. Before I do that, I'm going to just drop a link into the chat for everyone to get the source sheets for tonight. So please have a look at the link in the chat. If you've got any questions for Rabbanit Henkin, please just drop them into the chat throughout the course of the evening, and we can hopefully address some of them towards the end of the night. Thank you, Rabbanit Henkin, and thank you very much, everyone, for joining us.
Rabbi Meltzer, I was tempted to interrupt you and to tell you this is not a Hesped. I'm still alive and kicking, but I thank you. I thank you for the very kind words. Whether I'm worthy of them or not, I have questions. I want to thank you, Rabbi Meltzer, and I'd like to thank Or Chadash for inviting me to speak. It's a very exciting opportunity for me to have a conversation with individuals in Australia. I I've resisted invitations because of the length of travel from Israel. And on the other hand, I know there's a very important community in Australia. So thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to be part of this discourse on modernity and orthodoxy. So good evening to all. Here in Israel, the sun is shining. We're after Yom HaAtzmaut, the country is all decked out in blue and white. It's magnificent. And in that spirit, I address you. Rabbi Lamm, as I told Rabbi Meltzer a few moments ago, was very much of a mentor to me and very much of a backer of women's Torah, advanced higher Torah scholarship. Now, Rabbi Lamm had the advantage of being not just a Talmudist, a great Talmudist, but also a philosopher. And he took very seriously troubling passages in the Talmud, which might challenge someone in our day and age. And he wrote a wonderful article. He spoke about these things as well. He published a wonderful article many decades ago, which focused upon the Shalo Asani Isha blessing. In the morning, we Jews say a series of Birkot HaShachar blessings that reflect the individual awakening and becoming cognizant of the world around him and blessing God for the abilities he gives us, for our ability to stretch, for our ability to stand, for our ability to dress ourselves. And at the beginning of those blessings, there are three blessings which are troubling to the modern individual. The first one is Shelo Asani Goy. Blessed is God who has not made me a non-Jew. The second, this blessing will be found in the Siddur. I didn't put it on the sheets. The second blessing, Shelo Asani Abid, who has not made me a slave or a servant. The third is who has not made me a woman. And Rabbi Lamm acknowledges two things. He starts out by telling us, listen, Orthodox Judaism follows the rules even when the rules can be distressing or discordant for us. We don't play fast and loose with tradition or with halakha. And on the other hand, he says the world has changed. If we were to look at the explanations given for this blessing about women, Shelo Asani Isha, who has not made me a woman, there are two sources which I brought you on the sheet. You have the sheet in Hebrew and in English. Rabbi David Abudraham, in one moment, Rabbi David Abudraham, who was speaking to us from the early Middle Ages, comments that what's the reason that God has exempted women from time-bound mitzvot, or from, I should properly say, from 14 time-bound mitzvot. And he says, well, if the woman is obligated to her creator, but she also has domestic obligations in the home. This is predicated upon the assumption that the man is supporting the woman, and in return, the woman is performing services in the home, and together in the marital relationship, the home manages to sustain itself. There's a division of labor between the two. And Rabbi David Abudraham says, well, what would happen if women were obligated to time-bound responsibilities, and at the same time, there was a responsibility within the home that demanded her attention? And he says this, I'll just read the last two sentences. He says this in rather strong language. And if she were to perform If she were to perform the Creator's mitzvah and disregard the husband's command, woe to her from her husband. And if she were to perform his command and disregard the Creator's mitzvah, woe to her from her Maker. Therefore, the Creator exempted her from his commands so that she have peace with her husband. Now, how does this connect with the blessing that I'm speaking about? If you go to the 13th, 14th century authority on Jewish law, Rabbi Yaakov Baal HaTurim, he says that these three brachot refer to the number of mitzvot that the individual is commanded. The non-Jew has 7 mitzvot, the 7 no-hide laws, which I would just add parenthetically, they of course, certainly according to the Ramban, Nachmanides, these are very widespread obligations. The non-Jew doesn't get off easily. He is demanded to be moral, to create a moral and lawful society. However, he is not commanded with the 613 mitzvot that the Jew is. The next is the next in line is the slave, the non-Jewish slave of a Jew. This is in worlds in which slavery existed. And he is expected to observe the negative mitzvot, all of the prohibitions, and as well, or almost all of the prohibitions except for 2. And as well, he is obligated to observe those positive mitzvot that a woman is. Well, what's the difference between the woman and the slave if the mitzvot are identical? The answer is that the woman is a free individual. There's a world of difference between the two. And therefore, we start out with the lowest blessing, God who has distinguished between the Jew who has mitzvot and the Gentile or many mitzvot and the Gentile who has fewer mitzvot. The next stage would be the slave has more mitzvot than the Gentile, even though he is a Gentile, but not as many mitzvot as a man. And then we have the woman who has fewer, who is vastly beyond those 2 categories, but she has fewer mitzvot than the man does. Therefore, she makes a bracha, which is called Sha'asani Kirtzono, who has made me according to his will. What does Rabbi Lamm do with this? I may have made many of us somewhat uncomfortable by discussing these brachot, but the bottom line is that we Jews have this in our Siddur, and how do we handle it? So Rabbi Lamm goes on to say, well, in my opinion, what we should be doing is developing a philosophy of ratzon and understanding the difference between the place of man and the place of woman in Jewish life. And he goes on and explains this as follows, that man's religious life is based upon commandments. It's based upon religious discipline, never-ending compliance with the mitzvot. And this is what the man acknowledges in his blessing, who has not made me a woman. On the other hand, women's service of God generally exempts women from time-bound mitzvot. I would add that that's 14. And he says their observance, women's observance, takes into account the divine ratzon, stepping beyond the letter of the law to seek out a more spiritually elevated service. Ratzon means, what does God want for us? And this, Rabbi Lamm says, rising beyond the limitations of the must to the almost limitless sphere of the ought, should be our understanding of this blessing. Now, my friends, what this does is it it speaks to the sensibilities, in my opinion, of the postmodernist, and says, listen, religion is made up of two components. One of them is service to God according to a fixed set of rules. At least Judaism is made up of two components, and it is here that the male takes preeminence. The other side of it is there is room for the spirit, and without the spirit, we end up with a pallid religiosity. And here the woman takes um, uh, uh, preeminence. And I'm going to read one paragraph of which is so typical of Rabbi Lamm's thought. He says the former, he's referring to the system of that demands adherence at all times to mitzvot, um, um, or the multiplicity of mitzvot, because women are likewise commanded to adhere faithfully to the mitzvot at all times. But he says the abundance of mitzvot can lead, or the fact of of requiring discipline in religious service can lead to mechanical action, outward gestures without any spiritual dimension. The latter, which he is referring to, the soaring of the spirit, is in danger, and it is the greater danger of cutting loose from its moorings in the fundamental basis of the law, the overemphasis on the spiritual leading to antinomianism. Ossified recitation is not to be recommended for vital spiritual life, but it does promise the possibility of later change for the better, whereas abandonment of the halachic regimen of sacred quotidian performances, fixed performances by the hour, by reason of greater spirituality, usually forecloses the possibility of return to halachic norms. So what Rabbi Lamm is saying is you need both systems, and Judaism has found a balance between both systems by giving women latitude for the soaring of the spirit, not obligating the woman to all time-bound mitzvot, to certain yes and to certain no, and on the other hand, requiring religious discipline of the man. And these two need to fertilize each other. There needs to be a balance between the two. From here, from this point, Rabbi Lamm moves into the area of Torah study for women and of women's leadership, which is what I'd like to discuss with you today. And you have this on the source sheet. Rabbi Lamm was the first rabbi in the world to speak out on behalf of Yoatzot Halacha. Yoatzot Halacha are women who have been engaged in highest level halachic study for a period of years, and who have been qualified to be an address for questions of women. Today we have men as well interface with Yoatzot Halacha, and find as well rabbis turning to us. In any event, Yoatzot Halacha are an authority on the laws of mikvah, the laws of taharat hamishpacha, fertility, sexuality, and more. It's a tremendously broad area. And when we, for the first time, began qualifying women as Yoatzot Halacha, Rabbi Lamm spoke out on our behalf. He came to our first graduation and he spoke very movingly. I want to give you a little bit of background for what he said, and I'd like to study together what we're dealing with when we are speaking about women and rendering halachic decisions. I'm going to start with source B, Hebrew or English as you prefer. Please follow me on the source sheet. Halakha is case law, and we go back to precedents. Sometimes the precedents are biblical, sometimes the precedents are Talmudic. The Talmud discusses, and the medieval authorities discuss two precedents. No, not two precedents, a precedent of a woman who functioned as a judge. And this is approached from two areas as a basis for women rendering halachic rulings. The two routes of approach to the question go via a verse in the book of Dvarim and a verse in the book of Shoftim. Within the book of Dvarim, we find source number 3. I'm going to read this in the English. You shall appoint upon you a king whom the Almighty your God chooses. From amongst your brothers shall you appoint a king. You may not appoint upon you a Gentile who is not your brother. Som tasim alecha melech asher yibhar Hashem Elokecha bo, מקרב אחיך תשים עליך מלך, לא תוכל לתת עליך איש נכרי אשר לא אחיך הוא. This pasuk divides itself into 3 statements, and if you look very carefully at the pasuk, you see that it's repeating itself. Rabbinic exposition, drisha hilchati, is based upon the assumption that every word in the Torah, which is divine, has been carefully chosen, and if there is repetition, it is in order to teach us something. Now, if you look at source number 4, you see the Midrash Halacha on the book of Dvarim commenting about the mitzvah to appoint a king, and it says a king and not a queen. Where does the Sifri get this from? We can speculate by looking at the pasuk, and I think if we examine the pasuk closely, we'll see that what the Sifri is doing is looking at unnecessary repetition. Som tasim alecha melech, you shall place upon you a king whom Hashem your God chooses. From amongst your brethren you shall place upon you a king. You could eliminate one mention of melech by putting 2 clauses together. Som tasim alecha melech asher yivchar bo Hashem Elokecha mikerev achecha. By eliminating the repetition, you've eliminated an unnecessary writing of the word melech. Now, I'm being technical now. Shortly, we will it will be easier to follow. By eliminating an unnecessary repetition of the word melech, I believe the rabbinic tradition understands that leads us to the conclusion a king and not a queen. Hebrew is a gender-specific language. A tomato, agvania, is feminine. We have no neuter voice in Hebrew. Every word is either feminine or masculine. So agvania is feminine, whereas avatiach, a watermelon, is masculine. How do you indicate masculinity if you wish to say this must be a man? In other words, when God addresses Jews and says, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, he's addressing in the masculine and saying, I am Hashem, your God. But he means a God for women and a God for men as well. It is generally, the masculine voice is inclusive. How do we indicate that it's not inclusive? By unnecessary repetition. All of this is fine. I've just explained to you how the rabbinic tradition gets from this pasuk to a king and not a queen. But what's going to interest us very, very much is the Rambam, because in source number 3, Rambam tells us that you don't appoint a woman as a queen. The king must be a man. And he goes on to say, and likewise, to all appointments in Israel, we don't appoint other than a man. Now, I'm interested only in the area at this point of women in halachic ruling in this study together. So I'm not going to relate to other appointments in a separate shiur. That can be done. But regarding a king and not a queen, and Rambam's bringing that, there's a fascinating comment that comes from the 16th century from Rabbi David ben Zimra in Egypt, and he writes, number 6, and if you say indeed it is written, and Devorah was a prophetess, she judged Israel. This is not a problem, for she taught them the laws, or else it was by divine appointment. He brings us another pasuk from the book of Shoftim that says, "Udvorah isha neviah eshet lapidot v'hi shofta et Yisrael ba'et hahid." She judged Israel at that time, and he says, how can Rambam say a woman cannot be appointed? A judge is a high appointment. And Dvorah, who was not an evil woman, but she was a prophetess of God, functioned as a judge. He gives us two answers. And all of the Rishonim followed this format of two answers, an answer and then Inami, another answer. The first answer is she wasn't a judge. She taught them the judgments. And when we get to Tosfot in a minute, you'll see whom did she teach the judgments. The alternative is that yes, she was a judge. We are restricted from appointing a woman as a judge. However, God is not restricted, and he appointed Dvorah as a judge. If we were dealing with women and judges, I would bring you Rabbi Uziel's position on how we understand that today. But I'm not relating to that at this moment. I want to get to women and what Rabbi Lamm spoke about, pronouncing halachic rulings, issuing halachic. We approach this in number 7 as well. And that is the words of Tosfot. Tosfot say as follows. At the beginning, it is concluded from V'amdu shnei ha'anashim, the two men will stand before the judge. If so, a woman is disqualified from judging in a rabbinical court. For as we learn in Perek Basiman in Masechet Nida, Kol HaKasher Ladun Kasher Laha'id. One who is qualified to judge is qualified to testify. But it is written, and she judged Israel. How can we say a woman can't be a judge if we have a precedent of a prophetess of God who served as a judge? How can we say a woman cannot judge? So he gives us two answers. One must say she taught them the laws. The same as we read in Radbaz, we're now reading in Tosfot. She taught them the laws, or else kibluha alehem. They willingly accepted her words. Now, this is something fascinating. He's giving us two answers. He's saying, well, there are strictures within Judaism, but the strictures are not based upon prominence. You have here the most prominent woman of the generation, who actually was the leader of the generation. But there was one area which Jewish law restricts, and that is being a courtroom judge. How was she a courtroom judge? Position A, she wasn't a courtroom judge. She was the one who instructed, in other words, the halachic authority for courtroom judges. She wasn't the judge herself. She was the eminent halachic authority whom they turn to in order to understand the judgments. Possibility B is she was a courtroom judge, and Judaism allows us to choose our judges. There are judges who are appointed by the Sanhedrin, but there is also a mechanism called kibluhu aleihem. This is what we would refer to as a Beit Din Zabla, where one of the two disputants chooses a judge, the other disputant chooses a judge, and the two judges together choose a third judge, so we won't have a tied decision. That's what Tosfot are saying, and they're saying, yes, she can't be a judge appointed by the Sanhedrin, but she can be a judge who is chosen by the people. Chief Rabbi Uziel said, well, that's exactly what democracy is, being chosen by the people. But let's stay with the first opinion that she taught them the laws. I brought you, and you could read this afterwards, source number 8, where Ramban says she wasn't Nachmanides, 13th century. He says she wasn't a courtroom judge. She was the leader of the nation. She was the equivalent of prime minister or president of the nation. In other words, we get back to the fact that there are certain fields regarding which there are strictures, and there are others, for instance, being the primary leader of the Jewish people, which is not a problem in Jewish law. If you look at source 9, who is the last of the Rishonim, the early authorities until we get to the middle of the 16th century, Sefer HaChinuch speaks about issuing halachic rulings. Sefer HaChinuch is a book which describes all of the mitzvot of the Torah and discusses them at length. And he ends each mitzvah by saying this mitzvah applies at all times, or it applies only during the times of the temple. This mitzvah is obligatory only in the land of Israel, or is obligatory upon Jews wherever they live. And he says this mitzvah is incumbent upon all Jews, or this mitzvah is incumbent only upon males, or only upon the judges, as the mitzvah may be. So he discusses the mitzvah of issuing a halachic ruling, hora'ah. And the mitzvah comes together with not to issue a halachic ruling when drunk, not to enter the temple when drunk. The two come together because a high court, the Sanhedrin, while Beit Mikdash, while the temple existed, sat in the temple. So I'm going to read source 9. Not to enter the temple inebriated, and likewise not to issue a halachic ruling inebriated. In other words, not to rule on a matter of Torah law when a person is drunk. Now, whom does this apply to? And the prohibition of entering the temple while drunk applies during the time of the temple to men and women. And the prevention of halachic ruling in all places by men, the prevention of halachic ruling while drunk applies in all places to men, and likewise to a learned woman who is worthy of ruling. You have here, following the Rishonim who discuss a learned woman or a woman who can rule, you now have Sefer HaChinuch. We don't know who authored it, but we know this was authored in Spain before the expulsion from Spain, in other words, the end of the 15th century. And he says this law of how you must be when you issue a halachic ruling applies to men and it applies also to a learned woman. Why does he say learned woman? In my opinion, because without access to education, formal education, this is the case in the Jewish world, but it's the case in the world at large. The notion of a learned woman is something that we see every couple of hundred years. A woman who is as learned as the most prominent male scholars. She generally gets her education within the home from her father, who is one of the generation's leading rabbis. And it's important to Sefer HaChinuch to say, even though this is very theoretical, I am stating the law, and the law is that a woman who is qualified, I would add as well as a man who's qualified, can issue halachic ruling. In the end of the 18th century, the Minchat Chinuch, Rabbi Yosef Baban in Poland, writes as follows in his commentary on Sefer HaChinuch. The explanation appears to be that if the sages of a generation are divided regarding a ritual law, other than laws which require a court at the time of pronouncement of judgment, such as capital cases or litigation, if we're dealing with ritual law and we rule by majority, there's no difference. Even sages who are minors are counted as part of the majority if they're sages. And do not look, do not look at the picture, but on its contents. And likewise, learned women, like Dvorah, who judged Israel. So in a law which requires a court, a qualified court is required. But regarding controversy in any manner of Jewish law, there's no difference. Whosoever is learned, we consider his opinion regardless of who he is. That, in my opinion, is the next source, nearly final, that I want to put before you, comes from the same period, the end of the 18th century, but from Jerusalem. And the author is the Chida, Rabbi Chaim Yosef David Azulai, and he writes, even though a woman is disqualified from judging, he means in court of law, nevertheless a wise woman, can issue a halachic ruling. This is apparent from Tosfot, according to one option, that Dvorah taught them the law, one of Tosfot's two possibilities. She wasn't a judge, she was a judge. If she wasn't a judge, she taught them the law. Says the Chida, and you should know the Chida is the preeminent sage in Eretz Yisrael. He says what this teaches us, according to Tosfot, is that Dvorah was a poseket halacha. And likewise, you'll see in Sefer HaChinuch that in Siman 83, he agreed that a woman is disqualified from judging. And in Siman 158, regarding one who is drunk, he wrote, and likewise it applies to a learned woman who is worthy of ruling. Let me comment on these sources as follows. There's a wonderful Gemara in Masechet Sukkah that discusses whether an elephant can serve as the side of a sukkah. What this means is we need to have 2 and a something walls in order to have a kosher sukkah. Well, what happens if you have 2 walls, but you don't have a 3rd wall, and you do have an elephant? Can you tie down that elephant, and can the elephant serve as the wall of a sukkah? Parenthetically, I would add that the intention of Chazal is not to tell us to use an elephant as the side of a sukkah. But what Chazal are doing is taking the most extreme example possible, the most extreme illustration, in order to clarify just what is the law. So what happens if I have an elephant? Can he serve as the side of a sukkah? If you're interested in knowing, the answer is if he's tied down, yes, he can. because even if the elephant dies, he's going to still be the requisite 10 tfachim high that a wall needs to be. Why do I bring this to you? Because until we got to our times speaking about a woman who is sufficiently learned to address questions in Jewish law, and perhaps even to to decide questions in Jewish law, not just based upon precedent. This was theoretical. This was like discussing an elephant that's the side of a sukkah. We know it's a possibility within Jewish law to have such a woman, but we don't have such women within within Jewish life. That was the situation until we reached the 1990s. I want you to know, and Rabbi Lamm was referring to this when he spoke at our graduation so movingly, and he said, "It's nim v'lo nim." We're in at a moment in Jewish history when we can't even define what's going on, but we know a sea change is taking place, and we know that this sea change is a sea change for the better, and we know that this sea change is going to bring tremendous bracha to Jewish life. He was speaking about the first time that women have been qualified to render halachic rulings. Until now, the situation was theoretical. So we have Tosfot, who tell us that Devorah taught them the laws. Devorah, the prophetess, taught them the laws. And we have the Birkei Yosef, who says what Tosfot is saying is not that Devorah, the prophetess, was a second grade teacher. We're told in the previous pasuk, or at the end of that pasuk, Vaya'alu eleha b'nei Yisrael lamishpat. All Israel came up to her. The children of Israel came, but it doesn't mean the young elementary school children. It means the judges of the generation came in order to ask Dvorah questions. This was a theoretical situation. In my opinion, we're on a path today. I quote always the Gemara in Sota, which I brought you in Hebrew, as source number 12. Sota Daf Kaf Beit says, "Mai dichtiv ki rabim chalalim pila va'atzumim kol harugeha." The Gemara in Sota brings a pasuk from Mishlei, and it applies it not as it is contextually found in Mishlei. What does it mean that she has brought about many fallen and myriads of the number of those she has felled? כרבים חללים הפילה, זה תלמיד חכם שלא הגיע להוראה ומורה. She has caused many casualties. Who is that person? The Gemara says that person is a Talmid Chacham, a Torah scholar, a halachic scholar, who has not reached the stature of ruling and who nevertheless rules. In other words, he doesn't know his own limitation. He addresses issues that are beyond the scope of his knowledge or his judgment, and he causes tremendous damage. And then the Gemara goes on to say, and there are myriads that she has felled. That is a Talmid Chacham who reached the stature of ruling, but doesn't. And I believe that we were on a journey from Rabim Chalalim Hipila to Atzumim Kol Harugeha. When someone steps beyond their expertise, beyond their level of judgment, in order to issue a halachic ruling, the results can be problematic and It's even devastating. On the other hand, when someone knows how to rule, but keeps quiet and doesn't rule, we lose a resource for Jewish life which can bring profound blessing to the world. And I would say Atzumim is greater than Rabim. So we, in my opinion, are on a journey today, and I believe Rabbi Lamm recognized that when he spoke about Nim. For those of you who will read the wonderful book that Rabbi Meltzer referred to, you'll see Rabbi Lamm's words at our graduation, and he was saying there's something that's occurring that I can't exactly put my finger on. I understand that it is a new direction in Jewish life, which I believe in and which will bring profound blessing. My own feeling, and I, together with my husband and Rabbi Yaakov Varhaftig, have had the privilege of birthing direction in Jewish life. I would say that there's an important caveat here in the Gemara in Sota of understanding exactly where you are, what you are qualified to rule on, what you're not qualified to rule on. One needs to tread very, very carefully. But there is something going on in Jewish life, which is a sea change from the past. If I return to where I started in Rabbi Lamm's discussing of Ratzon, well, all of women's Torah learning is based upon Ratzon, not based upon the fact that we are commanded, other than, as Sefer Hasidim pointed out in the early Middle Ages, we are commanded to master the mitzvot, what's obligatory upon us, because if we're ignorant, how do we perform the mitzvot? But we have entered an area that Rabbi Lamm designated as Ratzon, that you have here an outpouring of religious energy in which women are saying, doesn't make sense. There shouldn't be a disparity between a high level of secular learning and a low level of religious learning. And I would say that it entered its second phase, the revolution of women's learning, when you have women who are qualified within fields of halakha to address questions. I would be happy to respond to anything that you might wish to comment upon, or to hear your comments about what I have said.
Rabbanit Henkin, thank you so much. Really, it's just so much to think about, and to hear from your perspective is just such a special opportunity. I found that idea of Rabbi Lamm's, that dichotomy of observance to really speak volumes. It's similar in a sense, and a parallel to the Rav's understanding of through his eulogy of the Rebbetzin of Talmud, of the idea of Musar Avicha v'Torah Timecha, which is something that resonates with me, and to hear you speak about that was really beautiful. As I said at the very beginning, I'm happy for people to drop some questions into the chat box. We do have a few minutes, but if I can, I would love to just, especially for our Australian audiences who are not so familiar with the Yoetzet Halacha program, I would really just love to understand. You spoke a little bit about its genesis and sort of what it's doing in the world, but I'd love to understand from you how the Yoetzet program and the Yoetzot themselves have changed the attitudes and practical realities for women, for women's health within their communities across the world.
Well, we've gotten upwards of 350,000 questions that have been addressed to Yoatzot Halacha over the years. I'm saying upwards of, I really don't know what the number is. We stopped counting at 350,000. We said to ourselves, enough is enough. Overnight, Yoatzot became the primary address for thousands of women to address questions having to do with mikveh, with fertility, with the laws of Tarat Mishpacha. We have over 160 Yoatzot worldwide. Many of them serve outside of Israel, most serve in Israel. They're accessible by a telephone hotline on a website, a marvelous website that functions in 4 languages, and as well within communities. And some of the access is informal and some comes via Nishmat's tools. The website, the hotline. We recently published the book, the first such book of Yoatzot Responsa. Let me see. Here's what it looks like. It's called Nishmat Habayit. It's an amazing book. It's published by Magid. I encourage everyone to look at it, to acquire it. It's available on Amazon or available from the publisher.
And for those of you in Australia, you can approach Gold's Dudeka. They'll bring in any of the Magid and Koren books. So please do. I'm ordering my copy.
I mean, it's when you say so. How have Yoatzot Halacha changed the world? There are various answers. On the one hand, it's a question of dignity. If a woman feels that there are questions which are intimate and she's not comfortable discussing them with the male rabbi, she has a female, a learned and qualified female to go to and to discuss the questions. And one of my favorite stories came from a Yoetzet Halacha who was appointed to a community in New Jersey. The rabbi was extremely supportive. It was he who brought in the Yoetzet Halacha, but he said to her, listen, I don't want you to be disappointed. Last year, I got all of 3 questions on Tarat Mishpacha, so please don't be dismayed if the hordes don't break down your door. Well, in her first year, she got upwards of 700 questions, and it rose from there. So the answer isn't just giving women dignity. It's enabling women to observe Tarat Mishpacha properly. It's enabling women not to be machmir when they shouldn't be machmir, and not to be makil when they shouldn't be makil. It's enabling women not to be lenient when the law is more stringent, and not to be stringent when the law is lenient. It brings solutions to women's life. Yoatzot Halacha trained not just in halacha, but also in women's medicine. And as a result, women's health, as a result, there's an opportunity to bring solutions to people's lives. Every Yoetzet has a story of a woman who comes over with with either a woman who sends her WhatsApps her an ultrasound showing the baby, or who pats her pregnant belly and says, this is your child. Women who have been trained have been able to find a bridge to better women's lives and couples' lives, to enable people who thought there were no answers to find an answer within the framework of halacha, fully faithful to halacha, on the other hand, that enables the couple to live better. It's life-changing.
I completely it's just so beautiful. And I have to say that just from my interactions with a number of Yoetzot Halachot in North America, you can see that hands down on the ground, and the changing attitudes of rabbis and community members, and just it's truly incredible. You and your husband were visionary in establishing this, and we owe you a huge debt of gratitude. So does all of Klal Yisrael. I think I'm going to end with this, Rabbanit Henkin, and I want to thank you so much for giving us of your time. Next week we have the incredible Dean Ronan Novik, the Dean of Azrieli, the Jewish Education School at Yeshiva University. Please do join us for that. Thank you very much for everyone from across the world for joining us tonight. Thank you to our Shira sponsors, our series sponsors, and our Chai supporters. Again, Rabbanit Henkin, thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your Torah from Eretz Israel. And we hope that we will be able to learn from you again, if not in person in Australia, at least maybe on another Zoom in the future.
It's a great treat to be able to see people in Australia without traveling. Thank you so much, Rabbi Meltzer.
Thank you very much.
Yes.